Edwin Carver's hands were covered in metal shavings when he made the discovery that would kill thousands of enemy soldiers. He wasn't a general, wasn't even a private, just a factory worker in Ohio who couldn't stop thinking about a problem nobody else seemed to care about. The rifle scopes kept drifting. Soldiers were missing shots they should have made. And Eddie, working alone in a dim workshop at midnight, was about to file away a piece of metal that the Army would call stupid, wasteful, and completely unnecessary, right up until the moment it started saving American lives on every battlefield, from Normandy to Okinawa. His supervisors would try to stop him. The bureaucrats would fight the change. But war doesn't wait for paperwork, and sometimes the best ideas come from the people nobody's listening to. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The winter of 1943 was brutal in Dayton, Ohio, and the cold seeped through every crack in the Army Ordnance Inspection Facility, where Edwin Carver spent 12 hours a day examining rifle components that would eventually make their way to soldiers fighting across two oceans. Eddie was 31 years old, too old for the draft and too essential in his role as a senior machinist to leave his post even if he wanted to. His workshop smelled of gun oil and metal dust, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a persistence that made his headaches worse by the end of each shift. He had worked in manufacturing since he was 16, learning the trade from his father, who had made parts for automobiles before the war effort, converted every factory in the Midwest into a producer of military hardware. Eddie's job was supposed to be simple. Rifle parts came down the line. He measured them against specifications, checked for defects, marked the approved pieces with a stamp, and sent them forward to assembly. But Eddie had always been the type of person who couldn't just follow instructions without understanding why the instructions existed in the first place. He questioned tolerances, asked about material choices, and drove his supervisors crazy by writing detailed reports about problems he noticed in the manufacturing process. Most of his suggestions were ignored. The factory had quotas to meet, and stopping production to investigate the theories of a machinist who'd never been to engineering school wasn't a priority when American boys needed rifles yesterday. The scope mounting problem first came to Eddie's attention in November of 1943 through a letter that wasn't supposed to reach him at all. His younger cousin Marcus was a Marine Corps sniper stationed somewhere in the Pacific, and in his rare letters home, Marcus usually kept things light and avoided talking about combat. But this particular letter was different. Marcus was frustrated, angry even, and he wrote about how his rifle scope would lose zero after just a few shots, forcing him to recalibrate constantly under conditions where taking extra time could mean the difference between completing a mission and getting killed. He described missing shots that should have been easy, watching enemy soldiers escape because his scope had drifted during transport or after firing a previous round. The other snipers in his unit had the same problem. They'd started to lose faith in their equipment, and in combat, doubt could be as deadly as a malfunctioning weapon. Eddie read that letter 3 times, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. His wife Helen had already gone to bed, and the house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the heating pipes. He thought about Marcus, who had been a kid interested in hunting and baseball just a few years ago, now lying in some jungle trying to make precision shots with equipment that couldn't hold its calibration. Eddie had inspected hundreds of those scope mounting rings. He'd approved them because they met the specifications on the paperwork. But meeting specifications and actually working in the field were apparently two different things. The next morning, Eddie arrived at the factory an hour early and went to the storage area where rejected parts were kept before being sent back for rework or scrap. He found a box of scope mounting rings that had been flagged for minor surface imperfections, nothing that affected their function but enough to keep them from being shipped. He took 2 of them to his workbench and began to examine them more carefully than he'd ever examined a part before. The rings were machined from solid steel, designed to clamp around a rifle scope and bolt onto the rifle's receiver. They looked sturdy, well-made, precisely manufactured to dimensions that had been calculated by Army engineers who presumably knew what they were doing. Eddie spent his lunch break that day in the factory's small technical library, looking through manuals and engineering drawings for the M1000, 903 Springfield rifle, and the various telescopic sights used by American snipers. The mounting system seemed straightforward enough. The scope sat in 2 rings, the rings clamped tight with screws, and the whole assembly bolted to the rifle. But as Eddie studied the drawings, he started to see a potential problem. When a rifle fired, it produced tremendous force that traveled through the weapon in complex ways. The recoil pushed the rifle backward into the shooter's shoulder, but there were also vibrations, torque, and harmonics that could affect every component. The scope and its mounts experienced all of these forces. And over time, even microscopic movements could accumulate into significant shifts in point of aim. The mounting rings were designed to hold tight through friction and the compression of metal against metal. But metal under stress behaves in ways that can be counterintuitive. If the rings were too rigid, they might actually amplify vibrations or create stress points that could shift over time. If they were too loose, well, that was obviously a problem. Eddie wondered if there was something in between, some way to allow the metal to flex just enough to absorb shock without allowing the scope to move. That evening, instead of going straight home after his shift, Eddie stayed late in the workshop. This was technically against regulations, as workers were supposed to leave the facility after their assigned hours for security reasons, but Eddie had a friendly relationship with the night security guard, a retired machinist named Walter, who sometimes let him stay to work on personal projects as long as he signed out properly. Eddie set up one of the rejected mounting rings in a vise and began to study it under magnification. He examined every surface, every angle, looking for something that might explain why these precisely manufactured parts were failing in the field. Around 9 o'clock that night, Eddie had an idea. It wasn't fully formed, more of an intuition based on years of working with metal and understanding how materials responded to stress. The mounting rings were solid and strong, but maybe they were too solid. When the rifle fired and the whole system experienced violent acceleration and deceleration, the rigid connection between the ring and the rifle might be transferring too much shock to the scope. What if the ring itself could act as a kind of shock absorber, not by being weak, but by having a designed point of controlled flex? Eddie took a thin file and carefully cut a small groove into the inner surface of one mounting ring, creating a shallow channel that ran partially around the circumference. The groove was only a few thousandths of an inch deep, barely visible, but it changed the structural dynamics of the ring. The metal could now flex slightly at that point, absorbing and dissipating energy rather than transmitting it directly to the scope. It was a gamble, an experiment based on intuition rather than calculation, but Eddie had learned to trust his feel for how metal behaved. He spent the next several nights refining the concept, trying different groove depths, different placements, different angles. He couldn't actually test the modification properly without a rifle and ammunition, which he didn't have access to, so he had to rely on his understanding of mechanical principles and his imagination of how the forces would interact. He made detailed notes in a small notebook, sketching diagrams and recording measurements. His wife started to worry about how late he was staying out, but Eddie couldn't let the idea go. Marcus was out there with a scope that drifted. Thousands of other American snipers were facing the same problem. If Eddie's modification could help, even a little bit, it was worth pursuing. The challenge was getting anyone to take him seriously. Eddie was a machinist, not an engineer. He hadn't gone to college. He didn't have a degree or credentials that would give his ideas automatic credibility. The Army Ordnance Department had entire teams of educated engineers who had designed the current mounting system, and suggesting that they'd missed something fundamental wasn't going to win Eddie any friends in the bureaucracy, but he had to try. In early December of 1943, Eddie wrote a formal report describing the scope drift problem as relayed by his cousin and proposing his modification as a potential solution. He included his sketches and calculations, such as they were, and submitted the report through official channels to his supervisor, a man named Gerald Hutchinson who managed the inspection department. Hutchinson was a by-the-book administrator who cared more about production quotas than experimental modifications. He read Eddie's report at his desk while Eddie stood waiting, then looked up with an expression that mixed pity with annoyance. "Carver, I appreciate the initiative, but this isn't how things work," Hutchinson said, tapping the report with his finger. "We have engineers for this sort of thing. Your job is to inspect parts, not redesign them. The mounting rings meet all specifications. If snipers are having problems in the field, that's a training issue or a maintenance issue, not a design flaw." Eddie tried to explain that the problem wasn't about meeting specifications on paper, but about performance under actual combat conditions, but Hutchinson wasn't interested. He filed the report away and told Eddie to focus on his assigned duties. Over the following weeks, Eddie continued to bring up the issue whenever he had the opportunity, but he was met with resistance at every level. The factory was under pressure to increase production, not slow down for experimental modifications. The engineering department didn't want to hear from a machinist about design flaws, and the military procurement officers who occasionally visited the facility were too busy managing contracts and schedules to entertain theories about scope mounting dynamics. Eddie became increasingly frustrated. He knew he was right, or at least he believed he was right, with enough conviction that the indifference of the bureaucracy felt like a personal affront. He started to become irritable at work, snapping at colleagues, making pointed comments about incompetence and waste. Helen noticed the change in his mood at home and tried to talk to him about it, but Eddie found it difficult to explain why he was so obsessed with a small piece of metal and a problem that most people didn't even acknowledge existed. How could he make her understand that somewhere in the Pacific, Marcus and hundreds of other snipers were at greater risk because nobody would listen to an idea that might save their lives. January of 1944 brought more letters from Marcus, though they arrived irregularly and were often weeks old by the time Eddie received them. In one letter, Marcus mentioned that his unit had received new rifles with supposedly improved scope mounts, but the problem persisted. Another sniper in his platoon had been killed during a mission, and while Marcus didn't say it directly, Eddie could read between the lines that equipment failure might have played a role. The letter made Eddie so angry that he crumpled it up and threw it across the room, before immediately retrieving it and smoothing it out carefully, as if the physical paper was somehow a connection to his cousin that needed to be preserved. Eddie decided to take a different approach. If official channels weren't going to work, he would make his case through demonstration. He spent his own money to purchase an old hunting rifle from a pawn shop, not the same model as the military used, but similar enough to test principles. He fabricated a makeshift scope mount using the same materials as the military rings and installed it on the rifle. Then he modified a second mount with his tension groove concept. He took both setups to a friend's farm outside of town on a Sunday morning in late January, where he could safely fire the rifle and test accuracy. The difference was immediately apparent. The unmodified mount, which Eddie had made to replicate the standard military design, showed the same kind of drift that Marcus had described. After firing 20 rounds, the point of impact had shifted more than 6 inches at 100 yards, but the modified mount with the tension groove maintained its zero much better. There was still some drift, which Eddie attributed to the crude nature of his prototype and the fact that he wasn't using military-grade components, but it was dramatically less than the control setup. Eddie carefully documented everything, taking notes and even bringing a camera to photograph the target patterns. Armed with this evidence, Eddie went back to Hutchinson and requested a meeting. He brought his photographs, his targets, his detailed notes. He explained the test methodology and the results. Hutchinson listened with grudging attention, but his conclusion remained the same. Eddie's personal experiments weren't scientifically rigorous enough to override the official engineering designs. The Army had testing protocols, and a machinist firing someone else's hunting rifle on a farm didn't meet those protocols. Hutchinson suggested, in a tone that was meant to be diplomatic but came across as condescending, that Eddie should be proud of his initiative but needed to understand his place in the organization. Eddie left that meeting feeling defeated. He'd done everything he could think of within the system, and the system had rejected him. He seriously considered dropping the whole thing, accepting that he'd tried his best and that sometimes good ideas get buried in bureaucracy. But that night, he received another letter from Marcus, and this one was different in tone from all the others. Marcus wrote about a mission where he'd had a clear shot at a high-value enemy officer, a target that could have changed the tactical situation for his unit, but his scope had been off and the shot had missed. The officer had escaped, and 3 days later, intelligence suggested that the same officer had coordinated an attack that killed 7 Marines. Marcus didn't explicitly blame the equipment failure for those deaths, but the implication was clear. Eddie read that letter sitting at his kitchen table, and when Helen came to check on him, she found him with tears running down his face, his fists clenched so tight that his knuckles were white. "I can fix this," Eddie said to her, his voice rough. "I know I can fix this, but nobody will listen." Helen sat down across from him and took his hands in hers. She was a practical woman, a teacher who had given up her job when she married but had kept her sharp mind and her ability to see through problems to solutions. "Then stop trying to convince people and just fix it," she said. "You have access to the parts. You know what needs to be done. Do it." Eddie looked at her, understanding what she was suggesting. "That would be... I'd be modifying military equipment without authorization. I could lose my job. I could get arrested." Helen squeezed his hands. "Marcus could die. Those other boys could die. You told me you're certain your modification would help. If you're that certain, then the question is what you're willing to risk to do the right thing." It was a moment that would define the rest of Eddie's life. He could play it safe, follow the rules, accept that he'd tried and failed through proper channels, or he could take a risk that might cost him everything but might also save lives. The decision, when he really thought about it, wasn't difficult at all. Starting the next day, Eddie began a quiet campaign of sabotage, though he preferred to think of it as unauthorized improvement. Whenever scope-mounting rings came through his inspection station, he would examine them carefully, and for the ones that met all other specifications, he would take them aside during his lunch break or after hours and add his tension groove modification. He was careful, methodical, making sure the modification was consistent and precise. He didn't modify every ring, because that would be too obvious. but he modified enough that a significant number of rifles being assembled would have his improved mounts. The work had to be done carefully and secretly. Eddie would take a few rings at a time to a corner of the workshop where he could work with some privacy, using hand tools that wouldn't make much noise. He developed a system where he could add the modification in about 15 minutes per ring, quick enough that it didn't interfere with his other duties, but thorough enough that the work was done properly. He kept no records of which specific rings he'd modified, because documentation would be evidence of his unauthorized actions. The modified rings went back into the inspection flow marked with his approval stamp, indistinguishable from standard parts except for a tiny groove that most people wouldn't notice even if they looked directly at it. Eddie lived in a state of constant anxiety during this period. Every time a supervisor walked past his station, he worried he'd been discovered. Every meeting called in the administrative offices made his stomach clench with fear that someone had noticed the modifications and traced them back to him. He had nightmares about military police arriving at his home, about being arrested for sabotage or treason, about Helen having to visit him in prison. But he kept going, because the alternative, doing nothing while soldiers died with faulty equipment, was worse than any personal risk. Weeks passed, then months. Eddie modified hundreds of mounting rings, sending them forward into the production chain where they would be assembled into rifles and shipped overseas. He had no way of knowing whether his modifications were making it to the field, whether they were actually helping, or whether the whole effort was futile. He just kept working, kept filing those small grooves, kept approving parts that were now different from their original specifications in a way that no one else seemed to notice. In March of 1944, Eddie received a letter from Marcus that made his hands shake as he opened it. Marcus wrote that something had changed with the rifles. The new scopes, or maybe the mounts, he wasn't sure which, were holding zero much better than before. The snipers in his unit had noticed it independently, comparing notes, and realizing that their accuracy had improved significantly over the past few weeks. Marcus specifically mentioned making shots that he wouldn't have trusted himself to take a month earlier, knowing the scope would hold true. He didn't know what had changed in the manufacturing process, but whatever it was working. Eddie read that letter over and over, barely able to believe it. His modifications were reaching the field. They were working. He wanted to shout, to tell someone, to get credit for what he'd done. But of course he couldn't. Claiming credit would mean admitting to unauthorized modifications of military equipment, which could still land him in serious trouble despite the positive results. So Eddie said nothing, told no one except Helen, and continued his secret work with renewed determination. The irony was that the official Army testing and evaluation process, the same system that had rejected Eddie's proposal months earlier, was now starting to notice that something had improved with the sniper rifles. Reports from the field indicated better accuracy and more consistent performance from scopes and mounts. The Army's Technical Services Division began investigating, trying to figure out what had changed. They examined manufacturing records, interviewed engineers, reviewed quality control processes. Nobody thought to ask the machinists on the factory floor. In April, a team of Army inspectors arrived at Eddie's facility to conduct a comprehensive review of the rifle scope mounting production line. Eddie knew this was potentially the moment where everything would unravel. If the inspectors examined the parts closely enough, if they compared current production to original specifications, they would discover the unauthorized modifications. Eddie considered confessing preemptively, trying to explain what he'd done and why, but he decided to wait and see how the inspection played out. The inspection took 3 days. Teams of officers and civilian engineers examined every stage of the production process, watched workers on the assembly line, reviewed documentation and specifications. Eddie was interviewed briefly as part of the standard process, asked routine questions about his inspection procedures and quality control methods. He answered carefully, truthfully about his official duties, while saying nothing about his unauthorized activities. The inspectors seemed most interested in the engineering and design phases of production, not the day-to-day work of the inspection staff. On the final day of the inspection, something unexpected happened. The lead inspector, a lieutenant colonel named Raymond Frost, called a meeting with the factory's senior staff to present preliminary findings. Eddie wasn't supposed to be in this meeting, as it was above his pay grade, but Hutchinson brought him along to answer any technical questions about the inspection process. The conference room was crowded with managers, engineers, and military personnel, and Eddie stood near the back, trying to be inconspicuous. Lieutenant Colonel Frost was a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful demeanor of someone who'd spent more time in laboratories than on battlefields. He began by praising the factory's production efficiency and quality control, then moved on to discuss the performance improvements that had been observed in the field. "Gentlemen, we have a mystery on our hands," Frost said, clicking through photographs of target patterns and data charts. Field reports indicate that rifles produced at this facility over the past 3 months show measurably better accuracy retention than earlier production runs or rifles from other facilities. The snipers love them, but when we examine your current manufacturing processes and compare them to the original specifications, we can't identify any changes that would account for this improvement. Eddie's heart was pounding so hard he thought people around him must be able to hear it. This was it. This was the moment where his secret would either be discovered or somehow remain hidden. Frost continued speaking, describing the various theories the investigation team had considered: component variations, material batch differences, assembly technique changes. But none of these theories fully explained the performance improvement. Then Frost said something that made Eddie's breath catch in his throat. We've examined sample parts from your current production and compared them to archive samples from 6 months ago, and we found one consistent difference. The scope mounting rings now feature a small tension relief groove on the inner surface. This groove doesn't appear in the original engineering specifications, and none of the engineers we've spoken to can explain when or why it was added. We need to know the origin of this modification, because it appears to be the key factor in the performance improvement we're seeing. The room erupted in confused conversation. Engineers insisted they hadn't changed the specifications. Managers claimed they hadn't authorized any modifications. Everyone looked baffled, and Eddie realized with a mixture of terror and dark humor that he'd accidentally created a situation where the Army had discovered an improvement but couldn't figure out where it came from. It was like a magic trick where the magician had forgotten how he'd done the trick. Hutchinson, Eddie's supervisor, stood up and asked for clarification. "Colonel Frost, are you saying there's been an unauthorized modification to a military specification design, and we don't know who made it or when?" Frost nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And before anyone panics about protocol violations, I want to be clear that this modification appears to be highly beneficial. Field testing shows an approximately 80% reduction in scope drift compared to the original design. Sniper effectiveness has increased dramatically. So, while we need to understand how this happened from a process control standpoint, the modification itself is something we want to keep and potentially expand to other facilities." Eddie stood frozen in the back of the room, his mind racing. He could stay silent, let the mystery remain unsolved, and continue his secret work. Or he could step forward and admit what he'd done, facing whatever consequences came with that admission. The decision was made easier by the fact that Frost had just said the modification was beneficial and that the Army wanted to keep it. Maybe, just maybe, Eddie could come forward without destroying his life. "Sir," Eddie heard himself saying, his voice sounding strange in his own ears, "I can explain the modification." Every head in the room turned to look at him. Hutchinson's face went pale. Frost looked curious, removing his glasses to get a better look at whoever had spoken from the back of the room. Eddie stepped forward, navigating between chairs and people until he was standing near the front, visible to everyone. "My name is Edwin Carver. I'm a senior machinist in the inspection department," Eddie began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I made those modifications. I've been adding the tension groove to mounting rings since early February." The room remained silent, everyone processing this confession. Hutchinson found his voice first. "Carver, what the hell are you talking about? You can't just modify military specifications on your own authority." "I know, sir," Eddie replied, looking at Hutchinson but speaking to the whole room. "But I tried to get authorization through proper channels, and I was told the idea was stupid and wasteful. My cousin is a Marine sniper. He wrote to me about scope drift problems, and I believed I knew how to fix it, so I just fixed it." Lieutenant Colonel Frost stepped forward, studying Eddie with increased interest. "You're saying you identified a design flaw, proposed a solution, were rejected through official channels, and then implemented your solution anyway without authorization?" "Yes, sir," Eddie said, deciding that honesty was his only viable strategy at this point. "I tested the concept on my own time with my own equipment first. When I saw that it worked, I started modifying parts that came through my inspection station. I was careful to maintain all other quality standards. The only change was the addition of the tension groove." "That's sabotage," someone said from the side of the room, an engineer Eddie didn't recognize. "That's unauthorized alteration of military equipment. He should be arrested." But Frost held up a hand. "Let's not be hasty. Mr. Carver, can you explain the engineering principle behind your modification? Why does this tension groove improve performance?" Eddie took a deep breath and explained his theory about how rigid mounting rings transmitted too much shock to the scope, and how a carefully placed groove allowed the metal to flex just enough to absorb and dissipate that shock without allowing the scope to shift. He described his testing methodology, his months of secret modifications, and his motivation rooted in wanting to help soldiers like his cousin. As he spoke, Eddie watched Frost's expression change from skepticism to interest to something like respect. When Eddie finished, Frost was quiet for a moment, then turned to the engineers in the room. "Is his theory sound?" One of the engineers, an older man with a thoughtful expression, spoke up. "It's actually, yes. It's a crude explanation, but the principle is solid. The tension groove effectively creates a controlled flex point that acts as a vibration damper. I'm embarrassed to say we didn't think of it. But it's exactly the kind of simple, elegant solution that often comes from practical experience rather than theoretical design." Frost turned back to Eddie. "How many rings have you modified?" "I don't have an exact count, sir," Eddie admitted. "I didn't keep records because I didn't want evidence of what I was doing. But I've been doing it consistently since early February, so probably somewhere between 500 and 800 rings. And you did this knowing you could be fired or prosecuted?" "Yes, sir. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because soldiers are dying out there with equipment that doesn't work as well as it should." The room remained tense and silent. Eddie could see different factions forming, people who thought he should be punished for violating procedures versus people who were impressed by his initiative and results. His fate hung in the balance, dependent on which perspective would win out in the bureaucratic aftermath of his confession. Lieutenant Colonel Frost made the decision. "Gentlemen, I'm going to make a recommendation to my superiors that Mr. Carver be commended rather than punished. His methods were unorthodox and did violate proper procedures, but his results have potentially saved American lives. The tension groove modification should be officially incorporated into the design specifications immediately, and we should investigate implementing it retroactively on rifles already in the field." He looked directly at Eddie. "Mr. Carver, you took a significant risk, and you got lucky that it worked out. If your modification had caused problems instead of solving them, this conversation would be very different. But you were right, and I respect the courage it took to act on your convictions." The meeting broke up shortly after that, with various people clustering in small groups to discuss what had just happened. Eddie found himself surrounded by some of the engineers, who wanted to understand the details of his modification and his testing process. Hutchinson pulled him aside with an expression Eddie couldn't quite read, a mixture of anger and grudging admiration. "You made me look like an idiot," Hutchinson said quietly. "But you were right, and I was wrong. I should have listened to you." "You were following procedures, sir," Eddie replied. "I was the one who broke the rules." "Sometimes the rules need to be broken," Hutchinson said, which was about as close to an apology as Eddie figured he would get. Over the following weeks, the Army moved with surprising speed to officially adopt Eddie's modification. The tension groove was added to the standard specifications for scope mounting rings, and production facilities across the country were instructed to implement the change. Engineers refined Eddie's basic concept, optimizing the groove dimensions and placement through rigorous testing, but the fundamental principle remained the same as what Eddie had filed into those first rings months ago. Retrofitting existing rifles in the field was deemed too labor-intensive, but new production incorporated the modification, and gradually, the improved accuracy spread across American sniper units in every theater of war. Eddie's role in the improvement was documented in official reports, though his name never became widely known outside of military procurement circles. He received a commendation letter from the Army Ordnance Department thanking him for his contribution to the war effort, and a modest financial award, a few $100s that Eddie used to buy war bonds. He continued working at the factory through the end of the war, no longer having to make secret modifications but instead working openly on quality improvement projects that his supervisors now actually listened to. The letters from Marcus became more regular and more positive. The scope drift problem had been solved, and the Marines in his unit trusted their equipment again. Marcus survived the war and came home in 1946, and one of the first things he did was visit Eddie and Helen to thank Eddie personally for fixing the rifles. The two men sat in Eddie's backyard on a warm summer evening, drinking beer and not talking about the war very much, but there was an understanding between them, a bond formed through letters and metal grooves and shots that hit their targets when they needed to. Eddie never really thought of himself as a hero. He was just a machinist who'd seen a problem and fixed it the only way he knew how. But in the years after the war, whenever he met other veterans and the conversation turned to equipment and weapons, Eddie would sometimes hear stories about sniper rifles that held their zero shot after shot, scopes that stayed true even after rough transport or hard use. He never told those veterans that he was the reason their scopes worked better, never claimed credit or sought recognition. It was enough to know that somewhere in the chaos and violence of war, his small modification had helped bring American soldiers home alive. The factory in Dayton closed in 1947 as military production wound down and the country transitioned back to civilian manufacturing. Eddie found work at an automotive plant, spending the next 20 years making parts for cars instead of weapons. He and Helen had 2 children, lived in a modest house, saved money carefully, and built a quiet, ordinary life. Eddie sometimes thought about writing a book about his experience, about the lessons he'd learned regarding bureaucracy and initiative, and the importance of listening to people regardless of their credentials, but he never got around to it. His story existed in Army reports and in the memories of snipers who never knew his name but whose lives had been touched by his work. In the 1970s, long after Eddie had retired, he received an unexpected visitor. A young Army historian researching the development of sniper technology during World War II had traced the origin of the tension groove modification and wanted to interview Eddie for an oral history project. Eddie spent an afternoon talking with the historian, describing his motivations and methods, reliving that period of anxiety and secret modifications, and the relief when it all worked out. The historian asked if Eddie had any regrets about the way he'd handled the situation. Eddie thought about it carefully before answering. "I regret that I had to go around the system instead of working through it," he said. "But I don't regret doing what I did, because it needed to be done. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking a risk and accepting that you might be punished for it. I was lucky. It worked out. But even if it hadn't, even if I'd been fired or prosecuted, I think I still would have done the same thing, because those soldiers deserved equipment that worked." The historian's project eventually became a book about weapons development during the war, and Eddie's story occupied a single chapter titled The Machinist's Modification. The book wasn't a bestseller, but it found an audience among military history enthusiasts and engineers interested in the interplay between design and practical application. Eddie received occasional letters from readers who thanked him for his service, or who shared their own stories of identifying problems and struggling to get anyone to listen. He answered every letter personally, encouraging people to trust their instincts and to have the courage to act when they saw something that needed fixing. Eddie Carver died in 1992 at the age of 80, surrounded by his family and secure in the knowledge that he'd lived a good life. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his work during the war, but didn't go into detail about the scope mounting modification. Most people who attended his funeral knew him as a quiet man who'd worked hard, raised a family, and been a good neighbor. Only a handful knew that his work had changed the nature of sniper warfare for the American military, and had saved countless lives in battles across the Pacific and Europe. The tension groove modification that Eddie pioneered remained a standard feature of scope mounting systems for decades, evolving and being refined as technology advanced but never abandoned. Modern sniper rifles use more sophisticated mounting systems with multiple features designed to maintain zero under harsh conditions, but the principle of controlled flex and vibration damping can be traced directly back to Eddie's innovation. In that sense, his legacy continued long after his death, embedded in the equipment carried by soldiers who would never know his name or hear his story. Looking back across the years, it's remarkable how a single person, working alone in a factory in Ohio, could have such a profound impact on military operations thousands of miles away. Eddie Carver wasn't a brilliant engineer or a decorated general. He was just a machinist with a cousin in the Marines and a stubborn refusal to accept that a solvable problem should go unsolved just because the bureaucracy wasn't interested. His story is a reminder that innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or think tanks, that sometimes the best ideas emerge from the people closest to the actual problems, and that having the courage to act on your convictions, even when everyone tells you you're wrong, can change the world in ways you never imagined. The rifles Eddie fixed are mostly gone now, scrapped or sold off or sitting in museums as historical artifacts. The soldiers who used them are old men or have passed away, their stories fading into history. But the principle remains, embedded in military doctrine and equipment design. When a sniper today takes a shot and the scope holds true, when the crosshairs stay aligned and the bullet goes exactly where it's supposed to go, there's a direct line connecting that moment back to a cold winter night in 1943, when a frustrated machinist named Eddie Carver decided that sometimes you have to break the rules to fix what's broken. His stupid fix, as his supervisors once called it, turned out to be anything but stupid. It was elegant, effective, and born from the kind of practical wisdom that only comes from years of working with your hands and trusting what you know to be true, even when everyone else dismisses it. And in the end, that wisdom saved lives, won battles, and proved that the best solutions often come from the most unexpected places.